Vegas, and then they stopped that, and then Nashville, as some of you know, and I'm not sure what their operation is now, but this is not PNA. So if anybody came in thinking that this was a talk about Northern Pacific, which is now New Pacific, it is not. This is talk about PNA. So sorry for some of these old, very poor photographs, but we'll go back to the beginning. As with most Alaska carriers, PNA was established by a bush flyer in the 1930s by the name of Art Woodley. So it was called Woodley Airways until after the war, after World War II. And in 1946, the name was changed to Pacific Northern. He wanted to call it Alaska Airlines, but there was another airline that had laid claim to the Alaska name. In fact, Alaska Star Airlines, which is why the designation for Alaska Airlines is AS, had laid claim to that name, so he had to call it Pacific Northern. And so originally it was Pacific Northern Airways, and then it became Pacific Northern Airlines. And so the real growth started in the 1950s. But to go back to the 40s, in Alaska in the 30s and the 40s, in the whole nation, the CAB controlled air travel. And in Alaska, which was a territory, the CAB decided that they had auspices over local markets in Alaska. So they were the ones who called the shots, and frequently Alaska bush pilots who'd started airlines would get in trouble with them. But there were a lot of things going on in the 40s and the 50s. Right after World War II was the Cold War, and so lots of military bases had been set up in Alaska or were continuing from the war, so there was a lot of DoD traffic to support new airlines. And the other thing was that it was the beginning of resource development in Alaska, which is mining, fisheries, and oil. And oil would play a much bigger part till by the end of the 1960s. And Alaska was interested in becoming a state. So those were all things that were going to generate traffic for new operators. And of course, Anchorage was strategic in its location, and it was known as the air crossroads of the world. So because of the ability for aircraft to fly, the inability of aircraft to fly long distances, Anchorage was a refueling stop for trips from the East Coast to the Orient and also from Europe to the Orient, up until the 1980s when the 747-400 was introduced. So there was lots of optimism in Alaska about what could happen with airlines. But as I said, PNA couldn't choose Alaska because the name was taken. And for Art Woodley, that was the start of a lifelong feud with the owners and the CEOs of Alaska Airlines. So he called his airline the Alaska Flag Airline. So in 1950, PNA was awarded by the CAB the rights to fly from the lower 48 to Alaska. So they were given routes from Portland and Seattle to Juneau, Ketchikan, and Anchorage, which was the mainstay of most of the population of Alaska, so that was very good. And since he only had DC-3s up to that point, he went into the used airplane market and bought his first DC-4 from Aerovías Guest in Mexico. Does anybody know what Guest became? Okay, so Guest became Mexicana, which is no longer, well, actually they've just restarted, but then he got a few more DC-4s on the used market. So there were a number of advantages for a long-haul carrier in Alaska, as I said. Resources abounded in Alaska, so he served the main fisheries centers, which were Western Alaska and Southeast Alaska. So the air cargo was enough to pay for the operation. And in fact, there was just a trickle of passengers. Does anybody know what the population of Alaska was in the 1950s and 60s? Anybody here ever heard of Akron, Ohio? More people live in Akron, Ohio than lived in the state of Alaska. And the land coverage of the state of Alaska was a 1/3 the size of the whole continental US. So a vast marketplace, but pretty thin and a trickle of passengers. So I used to say as a kid that our population was less than Akron, Ohio. So they ended up, as I said, serving 89% of the population of Alaska, excluding the Arctic and Fairbanks, which was the other 11%. And they got a low cost of aircraft acquisition because they bought all their airplanes on the secondary market. And I think Art Woodley was probably a lot like Don Nair up at Northwest. He was a skinflint when it came to investing any money in equipment and things like that. And so he was always looking for the shortcut to get equipment, get capacity in the marketplace. And in the 50s, well, I'll show you in just a minute. So this is what upper left-hand corner, you see a couple of DC-3s and a Constellation. That's Anchorage Airport in the mid-50s, where PNA was a major operator. And they operated the DC-3s, so that was probably a morning shot of the airport. And one of the DC-3s, it's on its way to Kenai, Homer, and Kodiak, or potentially Dillingham or King Salmon. And then one of the DC-3s is on its way to Cordova, Yakutat, and Juneau. And the Constellation, no doubt, is on its way to Kodiak or direct to Seattle. And then on the right-hand side, you have the DC-4s that were delivered in the mid-1950s, second-hand airplane. In the bottom right-hand corner was one of the few innovations, but for some reason, Art believed that the Alaska experience should be reflected in the aircraft cabin. So I think this is one of the earliest visual motifs in the cabin of the airplane. You see the spruce trees on the bulkhead. So that was a pretty rare kind of thing you would see in the mid-50s. And then when he got the 720s later, that he also used an Alaskan motif. So mid-50s, the fleet was made up of DC-3s mainly, and then later Constellations. And that's a shot of a DC-3 over the Alaska Range and then a PNA flight attendant. So the 1960s, in 1959, do you know what happened in Alaska? Alaska became the 49th state, right. And so that meant Art was at a point where he had to make some decisions. Now, he had Constellations in the fleet that he had bought in the secondhand market. He had leased the Chicago and Southern Constellations that Delta acquired in their merger from Delta. And then in 1956, I think he purchased them. But the top livery is the livery that was put on the airplanes in 1947 with the name change. And then the bottom, while I don't know this absolutely, but I think the livery was designed by Boeing's Design Bureau because they used the Stratotype, and it was the design that was going to go on the 720s, but he put them on the whole fleet. So you see the very first 720 on the left-hand side in the Boeing livery, and then you see some PNA flight attendants in the top right-hand corner, and you see an airplane on the ground in Anchorage. So a lot of those flight attendants went on to fly for Western and then later Delta. But since the merger occurred in 1967, they would have pretty much timed out by the 1990s. And I'm not sure who the last ex-PNA flight attendant that was flying for Delta was. So what was happening between 60 and 67, the last 7 years of PNA's existence? Well, they had an accident with the Constellation outbound from Anchorage, and I said, you know, there was really a trickle of passengers. So it was almost an even split between dead passengers and dead crew members. Everybody on the plane died, but there were only 7 passengers, so it was nearly an even split. And Art had a fondness for this particular Constellation 749, so he kept looking for them on the used market, and he would constantly buy them to reinvigorate the fleet. And so the Constellations flew mainly in Alaska, but in 1959 he was awarded a route from Seattle to Kodiak, where there was a naval station, so there was a steady trickle of passengers. So he operated a Constellation up until the merger between Kodiak and Seattle, and then after the merger, Western operated the Constellation until they discontinued the route. So there was robust growth in air travel in Alaska, and robust competition as well, because there were quite a few competitors for a really thin market. It would be as if all of the trunk carriers in the United States were serving Akron, Ohio, and fighting over local market. So in 1962, he placed an order with Boeing for a couple of 720s. And this was well after his main competitors in Alaska. Well, if you ask Art, he would say, my main competitor are those son of a bitches at Alaska Airlines, because he always talked of Blue Streak. But his main competitors were Northwest and to a lesser degree Pan Am. But Pan American flew in Alaska for decades. They started as Pacific Alaska, and then it became Pan American. And they started operating 707s in Alaska on the 1st of March of 1960. So that was the first sort of foray into the jet age. Also in 1960, Northwest Airlines, which had routes to Seattle from Anchorage, put their first DC-8 on that route. So they had that competition. So he had that competition to deal with, and so the customer was faced with a 749 Constellation or a jet. So you either had a 7.5 to 8 hour flight, or you had a 3-hour flight. So it wasn't really. So he was getting his clock cleaned, and he went to Boeing and he said, I need new equipment. They said, we can get you something by 62. We've got a new model out, the 720, so if you buy a couple of those, you can get pretty much to the head of the line. So what else happened in 1962? The World's Fair was in Seattle, and the supposition was that the World's Fair would generate a lot of post-vacation travel to Alaska, which it did to a degree. And he had to replace the Constellation that he had lost, so he added another one to the fleet. And the staff was at 627 people in 1960, but in 1958 they had carried their millionth passenger. Not that year, but in the history of the airline. So you can see it takes a long time with little numbers to add up to 1 million. So this was the first 720 over the Space Needle in Seattle in 1962. And by the way, I said I never flew PNA, but I flew in those airplanes many, many times. Can anybody guess why? Okay, I'll tell you the answer to that question a little later. So this is a typical PNA advertisement. So PNA was a bare bones operation. Art was kind of a skinflint, and while Alaska Airlines was doing lots of relatively innovative marketing because they would hire professional marketers, PNA didn't believe in any of that, so it was just the goods. In fact, if you looked at their timetable, the cover of the timetable didn't change from 1947 until they ended in 1967. The cover of the timetable was always the date, an artist's rendition of an airplane that they were flying at the time, either the Constellation or the 720, and a route map. So the route map was basically Seattle, Anchorage with stops in Ketchikan, Juneau, Yakutat, and Cordova, and then the Western Alaska and the Kodiak service. So that was PNA. So this ad tells you just the facts, folks. Jets to all 3 of Alaska's major cities, with the exception of Fairbanks, of course, on a daily basis on PNA. So Art did have dreams of expanding his airline. So does anybody remember when the CAB was a functioning entity in the government? You all remember that they had the last word on any route assignment. Airlines didn't have the freedom to go out and choose where they wanted to fly. Is everybody familiar with that idea? Yeah. So the CAB had a Trans-Pacific case going on in 1960, which was very, very political, with the exception of PNA, which had applied for routes from Alaska to Hawaii. So again, you have to remember these are pretty thin markets, and they were the only applicant except Alaska Airlines. So they thought, since they had equipment to operate the route, or so they said, that they would be an incumbent and have a good chance of being at the head of the line. But of course, the case was decided after the merger. In 1965, there was a re-allotment of the service, the long-haul service to Alaska. So Alaska Airlines was awarded a revised States Alaska certificate that allowed them to fly now from Anchorage nonstop to Seattle. Anchorage being the preferred market because it was the population center and also the major connecting point. So Alaska had been operating Seattle to Fairbanks, and then they were now operating, well, they were operating Seattle, Fairbanks, Anchorage. So one stop to Anchorage. And most of the passengers on the airplane weren't going to Fairbanks, they were going through to Anchorage. So they wanted to revise their certificate to fly from Fairbanks to Anchorage to Seattle, which they were awarded in 1965. And they immediately went to Boeing and ordered some 727s. Because as you know, the old billboard said they had 4 jets daily to Alaska. Does anybody remember or have they ever heard this story? Well, their first jet was a Convair 880 that they got in 1961, a 4-engine jet. So they said they had 4 jets daily to Alaska. But it was really just one flight with a turn. So the old rivalry between Alaska and PNA escalated. Art Woodley loathed Charlie Willis. Now Charlie Willis was he was not a Bush pilot. He actually came in control of Alaska Airlines in 1958. Charlie Willis was a World War II vet, and he had been a flyer, and so, yet again, he's a pilot, so he spoke a pilot's language, and he took over Alaska Airlines. And then in 1966, there was a lot of consolidation going because the carriers in Alaska generally were just eking by a profit or not making money, just missing the profit goal. So Charlie decided he needed all the feed from the smaller carriers. So he was wanting to get into the turf of PNA in Southeast Alaska. So he merged Alaska Airlines with Cordova Airlines, which flew to Juneau from Anchorage, and Alaska Coastal Ellis, which had main bases in Anchorage, or in Ketchikan, Juneau, and Sitka. So it was a very mixed fleet by 1967. Alaska Airlines had everything from Drum and Goose to Catalina flying boats to Twin Otters to 727s, and not making money because they had combined too many airplanes and too many divergent sorts of operations, but it was a bit of a mess. PNA at the time went to Boeing and ordered 727s to replace the 720s. Unfortunately, Art Woodley was unsuccessful in getting financing, so that order went to somebody else eventually. And so he was panicked by the fact that he couldn't get even bank support. And it was another reason to hate Charlie Willis, because he always got his fleet financed. Does anybody know why Charlie always got his fleet financed? He married well. He married Elizabeth Firestone, the tires, right? So Firestone was underwriting all Charlie's acquisitions. And so it was like these things were the kinds of things to make Art Woodley go crazy. That son of a bitch at Alaska Airlines married money, and now he has this line of credit from Firestone, and I can't compete with that. Now Boeing won't even deliver my 727s that I've ordered. Because of course the 727 was in demand, and Boeing wasn't going to wait for them to complete the financing, so Art lost his order. So at that point, the CAB was really pushing PNA and Alaska to merge, because not only did they have route authority, but they had revenue authority too. And if you were operating routes and you weren't making money, that meant the CAB sometimes had to make up for that with subsidies. But the other thing was that they would say, we will look more favorably on any application you have for expansion if you do what we tell you to do. So it definitely wasn't a free market economy. So in 1966, Art Woodley was without new airplanes to replace the 720s, and he was without the possibility of expansion because he was cash poor, and his competitor had a line of credit, and his other competitors were making money globally, which were, of course, Pan Am, which was serving Southeast Alaska, Ketchikan and Juneau, en route to Fairbanks. And so he had Pan Am to deal with their 707s, and Northwest to deal with their 707s and DC-8s from Anchorage, Chicago, nonstops to Anchorage. So he was really in a fairly precarious situation. And so his main competitor, or what he thought was his main competitor, was out there doing things like acquisitions with the carriers that used to feed PNA. So he was in a situation where he also had to look at a merger. So he was still acquiring constellations. He got another one from TWA because they lost one in Kenai in a hard landing. And he was still in the midst of this Trans-Pacific case, and he figured he had a good chance of expansion, but he wasn't going to be able to do it if he couldn't come up with any cash. And so PNA and Western got a very interesting idea that maybe they could consolidate. And it was kind of unique because Western was making money at the time and PNA had made a little money, and usually if you weren't in financial distress, you weren't approved for a merger by the CAB. So, but they were approved, and so it was completed on October 1st, 1967. So that meant that Western would move into Alaska. So they were retiring their Electras on the West Coast. They moved them into the service in Southeast Alaska, and the PNA Connies were finally, after a year, retired, of which there were 6 at the time. And then, of course, as a post-mortem, Western merged with Delta in 1987. But this is kind of a nostalgic shot. 1960, on the left-hand side, you see a 749 Constellation and a Western 707, and that was sort of a precursor of what was to come. And on the right-hand side is an image of the Alaska flag line, which is now part of the United States. So that was 1959. And here's one of the Connies over Seattle, probably about 1960. And another view of the 749. So Art loved these airplanes, like I said, and he continued to look for them on the secondary market. So, and at the time that Western and PNA merged, Western had never operated any Constellations. They had had DC-6Bs and Electras. So that brings us to 1967, and essentially that was 25 to 30 years for both Alaska Airlines and Art Woodley's operation, Pacific Northern, which they were both calling an era of progress. So you see the annual report for Alaska Airlines on the right-hand side with his nemesis, Charlie Willis, and you see PNA on the other side. And so Alaska had gotten involved in oil development on the North Slope, which PNA did not do, so they suddenly had a lot more capital at their within reach. So they bought 382 Hercules to operate in the North Slope, all cargo operation. They had 7 brand new 727s for the passenger service, and they had a lone Convair 990 that replaced the 880. And then they had the Catalinas and the Grub and Goose, and they had Convair 240s and 340s to serve Southeast Alaska. So it was a bigger operation. And this was the 25th anniversary of PNA, and I like this picture because it speaks volumes about what was going on in Alaska. So from left to right, on the far left, you have Mudhole Merrill Smith. He was the owner of Cordova Airlines. Okay, and then you have, next to him, you have Bob Reeve, who was Revolution in Alaska, another local carrier in Alaska. Then you have Art Woodley in the middle, and then on his left is Ray Peterson from Northern Consolidated, which in the following year would become Ween Consolidated because they merged with Ween Alaska Airlines. So these are basically the major domos of the airline business in Alaska. And Art Woodley kind of considered he was the godfather, but everyone that was standing next to him was going to double deal him because Merrill Smith was going to merge with Charlie Willis, which he hadn't told Art Woodley about, and Bob Reeve was actually going to start to fly to Seattle with his Electras from Cold Bay, so that would take away some feed traffic, and Ray Peterson was merging with Ween, which he hadn't told Art about. So anyway, all his good buddies were double-crossing him. And they all had secrets that night at the dinner, which I find, interesting. So here we have the merger and marriage of PNA and Western. And then you have the converted, they turned the Electras into combis to operate in Alaska. So the original combis in Southeast Alaska were not Alaska's milk run combis. They carried freight and passengers, but they were the Electras that Western put into the market. And here's a couple of snapshots. So on the on the left-hand side are the gals from PNA, and another shot on the ground in Anchorage. And then that shot from 1960. And how many people have seen this? So a Western Constellation. So they were in service about a year. Western repainted the entire fleet, and then later they brought in the Electras, as I said.
One of those wound up at Tucumán Airport in Panama, and it was left there derelict for years, the paint and everything turning black on it, and finally it was scrapped.
And it still had the Indian head livery?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, lots of changes, but, so these airplanes really fit the Alaska short-haul markets.
Did Reed fly those Electras?
No. Oh, I'm sorry. Reeve did fly the Electras, but they acquired their Electras from Air New Zealand. Oh, the other thing I could say about the shot of the fellas together is that with the exception of Alaska Airlines, all those brands disappeared. So on the outside, Ween Consolidated became Ween Air Alaska, and it was out of business by the 80s. And Revolution lasted until 1999, and then they were out of business. So lots of changes and kind of a heartbreak in a way. So here's a PNA in 1968. So you have the Constellations leaving the PNA livery and getting into the Western Indian head livery, and then the introduction of the Electras into the Alaska market. So post-mortem, Western did get the Hawaii-Alaska routes because Pacific Northern had made the case, and when they merged with PNA, they had access to that. So in the Trans-Pacific route case, they were awarded Anchorage to Honolulu, and then they, on their own, had gotten LA to Honolulu and San Francisco. So they created a fare for Alaskans, which was called the Triangle Fare, which meant you could stop over in Honolulu coming to or from Alaska, which was a marketing coup for Western. So they had lots of available seats on the Honolulu Anchorage route, and so they were able to innovate that, and it was a very popular stopover, obviously. And then, as I said earlier, the Electras were introduced into Southeast Alaska as combis, and I said I had flown with PNA's 720s many, many times. That's because Alaska acquired PNA's 720s. I don't know if you all knew that, but so they were perfect because they had the Alaska motif on the interiors, and traffic was surging in Alaska. Alaska needed equipment right away, and of course I'm sure that Art Woodley was like crazy. He was on the board of Western now, and I'm sure when they came in and said, well, here's something we're going to do, he probably went crazy and said, don't sell those son of a bitches my 720s, but they needed them at the time because the oil traffic was really surging. And so Alaska got the PNA 720s. And Western provided the first through plane service from Anchorage beyond Seattle on the Pacific coast, which was a first. And Alaska focused on the Alaska market as the oil industry was surging, and so their first profitable years were in the early 70s because they basically had the ex-PNA capacity and they had access to the oil markets, so they were expanding in Alaska. So interestingly, Alaska was the carrier that was the survivor of the whole bunch of that group at dinner. Well, they weren't invited to that dinner, but maybe that was lucky because they were the survivor, and now Alaska has more than 100 cities on their network throughout the U.S., and they're the 5th largest airline in the United States. And so that was the Alaska livery on the original 720As that they acquired from PNA. And I know some of you want to get pictures of this. And this is the Alaska Airlines of today. and I just made up a little chart. So Alaska, in the late 80s, they acquired Horizon Air in the Northwest. They also purchased Jet America. And then a few years ago, 2018, they acquired Virgin America. And next on the docket is Hawaiian. Can anybody tell me who the biggest current carrier between the mainland US and Hawaii is?
Southwest.
Alaska. Southwest, I don't know where Southwest's numbers are, but Alaska took the opportunity a few years back to start to serve all the islands from all the major West Coast markets. And now they're going to acquire Hawaiian Air. And so what happened to PNA? Of course, they went into Western, and Western disappeared into Delta. So that brand is 60 years gone. And Northern Consolidated merged with Wien, and then as Wien consolidated, and then later Wien Air Alaska, they went out of business in the 1980s. And Pacific Alaska, which was a subsidiary of Pan American, Pan American disappeared in the early 1990s, and Panagra had been consolidated into Pan Am. So it wasn't a rich history of survival in Alaska unless your name was Alaska, I guess. So, any questions?
So
Sir?
Delta today has a very small presence in Alaska.
Delta does, yes, because most of what they got from the mergers, well, most of what Western got from PNA, they let go of. So all the Western Alaska service, Kodiak, Homer, Kenai, they stopped flying that.
So that went away when Delta
Right.
took over Western. Okay,
But Delta does a little more than Western did, because Delta flies into Fairbanks and Juneau and Sitka and Ketchikan.
Okay.
So because they developed a hub to compete with Alaska Airlines in Seattle. So they wanted what feeder traffic they could get. So they operate 175s into Southeast Alaska. And they do 737 in the high season to Fairbanks. I don't think they run it year round. And then they do some Anchorage to Minneapolis, Anchorage to Salt Lake City, and Anchorage to Seattle. Any other questions?
Where the headquarters for PNA was in
Seattle. So Alaska Airlines and PNA were both headquartered in Seattle because there was this assumption that there was an advantage being closer to the capital markets, and then later, as Boeing operators, there was an advantage of being closer to Boeing. You wouldn't have to carry as many spares in your inventory. Any other questions? Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for when they asked me, I thought it was kind of an arcade. I hope this has been an interesting presentation for you. Because I thought later, you know, it sort of reflects the history of air travel in Alaska and the commercial operators and the original Bush airlines that were established by the Bush pilots. And so most of this happened after the war, even though they started their fairly limited operations in the early 30s. That was the case with Wien, that was the case with Reeve, that was the case with Woodley, and Alaska Airlines was a consolidation of several Bush operations under the Alaska banner after the war. So anyway, any other questions? I'll be here for a few minutes, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.